January 1945. The transport ship rolled through a winter Atlantic that smelled of iron, salt, and distant engines. Every vibration from the hull felt like a reminder of how far the war had collapsed behind them. Along the starboard rail stood more than 60 German generals, men who once commanded divisions, corps, entire regions, now reduced to prisoners staring into gray mist that clung to their coats like ash. General Karl Heinrich Vogler gripped the cold steel railing, listening to the slow thud of the engines beneath his boots. For years, he had heard broadcasts describing America as decadent, chaotic, brittle beneath its machines. He had believed some of it, doubted some of it, and ignored the rest. But as the ship crept forward, a call echoed across the deck. Landfall! The prisoners lifted their heads. Guards barked orders. Boots scraped across wet metal. And then the fog opened. New York Harbor unfurled in morning light, intact, immense, moving with the rhythm of a world untouched by ruin. Cranes swung like giants. Ferries carved ribbons across the water. Glass towers rose in clean lines against the sky. The sight demanded an explanation that none of them yet had, one rooted in the world they were about to enter. By early 1945, the war in Europe was nearing its cataclysmic conclusion. Germany's front lines had crumbled under the combined pressure of Soviet advances from the east and the relentless push of Allied forces from the west. Cities lay in ruin, transportation networks were shattered, and supplies ran perilously low. Yet even as the Reich's armies faltered, propaganda maintained a narrative of strength and inevitability. Radio broadcasts and newspapers spoke of a decadent, vulnerable America, of cities burning under imagined attacks, of an enemy too fragile to pose a real threat. Against this backdrop, the United States faced an unusual logistical and strategic challenge: how to secure and interrogate the highest-ranking enemy officers captured in Europe. Men like General Karl Heinrich Vogler and General Hermann Dent, once commanders of tens of thousands of troops, were deemed too valuable for ordinary POW camps. They were shipped across the Atlantic under strict supervision, isolated from lower-ranking prisoners to prevent intelligence leaks and protect both the prisoners and their captors. The journey itself, weeks aboard cold, steel-hulled vessels, was part transport, part psychological preparation. For the generals, the Atlantic crossing was also a confrontation with expectation. They had been drilled to believe that American society was fractured, its people demoralized, its cities vulnerable. Rumors circulated among the prisoners, whispered in corners, about starving civilians, chaotic streets, and mobs ready to jeer their arrival. Yet, beneath the fog and salt spray, a quiet dissonance began to stir. The world they had imagined, projected from propaganda and fear, had yet to materialize before their eyes. The engines thudded beneath the deck. Somewhere beyond the gray horizon lay a nation they had been taught to despise, a nation whose reality would soon challenge everything they thought they knew. Once ashore, the purpose behind their unusual captivity became clearer. The United States had designed camps like Fort Hunt, Virginia, not merely as prisons, but as controlled environments for gathering intelligence and observing the mindset of the Reich's most senior officers. These installations were remote, secure, and equipped with the infrastructure to accommodate the comfort of high-ranking prisoners without compromising safety. Clean barracks, regulated meals, and orderly routines were not indulgences. They were deliberate tools, ensuring that the officers remained coherent, alert, and susceptible to interrogation. American military intelligence approached these prisoners as both subjects of study and potential instruments for post-war planning. Every interaction, from logistical discussions to casual observations, was designed to test assumptions, measure knowledge, and reveal decision-making patterns cultivated over years of command. Officers trained in psychology, logistics, and military science. The contrast between expectation and reality was already forming a subtle but profound shock. Here, authority functioned not through fear, but through trust, courtesy, and transparent discipline. The general's indoctrination had conditioned them to expect chaos and moral weakness. Propaganda had painted American democracy as fragile, a system where freedom masked incompetence, where the people were idle or resentful. Yet, the first glimpses of the American cities, the rhythm of docks and warehouses, the efficiency of railroads and ports, hinted at a different reality, an industrial and civic order sustained by citizen initiative, not enforced through coercion. By the time the convoy of trucks moved inland toward the camps, the prisoners were already confronting a dissonance between ideology and evidence, a dissonance that would define the months ahead and set the stage for the deeper human and moral revelations to come. The shock on the generals' faces was immediate and unmistakable. Men who had commanded tens of thousands, who had orchestrated campaigns across Europe, now found themselves silent observers in a world they had been taught to despise. Vogler, Dent, and their peers struggled to reconcile the abundance around them with the scarcity they had left behind. Bread, meat, clean water, functioning streets, ordinary necessities appeared as extraordinary luxuries to officers conditioned to see civilization under siege. Guilt mingled with disbelief. Some whispered fears that this was staged, an elaborate theater designed to humiliate them. Yet the more they moved through towns and cities, the more impossible it became to dismiss the reality. Everyday life continued uninterrupted. Children played along the railways, women crossed streets carrying groceries, workers unloaded freight with calm precision. The human reality of freedom, ease, and civic competence struck the generals as both alien and profoundly unsettling, forcing a confrontation not with guns or strategy, but with the ordinary rhythms of a society that functioned without intimidation. For generals whose lives revolved around logistics and supply chains, America's machinery was a revelation. Railroads ran perfectly straight for miles, trains glided past farms and factories, and industrial plants operated with a rhythm that suggested orchestration without direct oversight. The Iowa grain elevators, the freight barges in New York Harbor, and the endless lines of trucks moving goods inland demonstrated efficiency on a scale Germany had never maintained under wartime strain. The prisoners noted the meticulous planning of agriculture, the alignment of barns, and the engineering of factory conveyors. Even small towns displayed mechanical precision. Streetcars, public utilities, and functional infrastructure, all maintained without coercion. For men trained to command through hierarchy and enforcement, witnessing an entire continent operate efficiently through systems, culture, and civic habit rather than fear was a jarring lesson. The machinery of American life seemed to function as if self-governing, and it produced results that rivaled and sometimes surpassed what European generals could achieve with armies. American military discipline manifested differently from what the German officers expected. Guards did not shout or strike. Orders were given calmly, obeyed immediately, and reinforced through mutual understanding rather than fear. Daily routines were predictable and punctual. Meals at fixed hours, orderly inspections, structured labor or lectures, but always delivered with courtesy. Interrogations were analytical rather than punitive. Officers like Captain Hollis treated the generals as professional equals, engaging them in detailed discussions about logistics and supply, comparing maps and strategies without condescension. This approach challenged the German officers' ingrained understanding of authority, which had relied on rank, intimidation, and ritualized obedience. In America, authority existed transparently, and discipline flowed from consent and expectation rather than compulsion. For generals accustomed to commanding armies with rigid hierarchy, the realization that effective power could exist without coercion became a recurring theme, a quiet, disorienting lesson in leadership by design rather than domination. The German generals had been raised to equate authority with domination, to see obedience enforced through fear and spectacle. In America, they encountered a different logic. Rules were followed because they were understood, respected, and integrated into the daily rhythm of life. Civilians worked, produced, and organized society not out of compulsion, but through collective responsibility and shared purpose. Even within the camps, the enforcement of regulations relied on clarity, consistency, and mutual respect. Guards saluted politely, meals were served on schedule, and instructions were issued once without the need for intimidation. For the generals accustomed to the coercive rituals of Nazi hierarchy, the absence of visible enforcement did not indicate weakness. It revealed a form of authority anchored in trust. Democracy, messy and decentralized, achieved order through transparency and participation, a principle they had never considered viable in wartime command. Each day underscored the paradox. Obedience could exist without oppression, and freedom could coexist with efficiency. Morality, as experienced by the generals in American captivity, was disarming. Geneva Convention compliance was strict but humane. Clean quarters, regular meals, medical care, and personal space contrasted sharply with the brutal conditions experienced by lower-ranking POWs elsewhere in Europe. Gifts during Christmas, the provision of books, and courteous treatment were not gestures of propaganda. They were deliberate acts of principle. Men trained to command through fear found themselves receiving care from soldiers who owed them nothing, and this care did not seek to humiliate or manipulate. Each small act, a cup of coffee offered, a polite greeting, a fair adjudication of disputes, became a lesson in human decency unmediated by rank or ideology. Slowly, the generals began to understand that strength could be exercised without cruelty, and that moral authority could coexist with practical command. The realization unsettled them more profoundly than confrontation on a battlefield ever could. Finally, the abundance surrounding the prisoners revealed a stark contrast with the starvation-stricken landscape of post-war Germany. Shops stocked with goods, functional railways, and thriving agriculture confronted their preconceptions of democratic inefficiency. Every town, every field, every industrial complex functioned as a proof of capability. Citizens were equipped to meet needs without relying on coercion. Food production, distribution, and consumption were all orchestrated through civic systems rather than through force. For generals who had endured bombed-out streets, rationed supplies, and starving civilians, the sheer scale and reliability of American abundance was incomprehensible. Yet, the most profound shock was not material. It was moral and ideological. A society could thrive, maintain order, and generate prosperity without enforcing fear, without invoking propaganda, and without demanding ritualized allegiance. The cumulative impression was unavoidable. Efficiency, power, and wealth did not require oppression. In fact, they could flourish alongside freedom. The true turning point for the German generals came within weeks of their arrival at Fort Hunt. Life in the camp was orderly but unremarkable. Barracks with clean bedding, meals served punctually, lectures on engineering and agriculture. Yet, within this routine lay a subtle, relentless challenge to their assumptions. Each conversation with American officers chipped away at the worldview they had carried across the Atlantic. Captain Hollis, barely 30, approached Vogler with a question about supply lines on the Eastern Front. They traced movements across a blackboard, measuring distances and timetables. Hollis offered insight with quiet humor, comparing efficiency and resource allocation without judgment or condescension. Vogler, trained to command through hierarchy, found the interaction startling. An enemy treating him as a peer, analyzing his methods without mockery. The ideological armor he had worn for decades began to feel heavy, unnecessary, almost absurd. Beyond these sessions, daily life reinforced the lesson. Orders were obeyed calmly, but not fearfully. Breakfasts arrived on schedule. Barracks were inspected without shouting. Guards nodded, not barked, and small grievances were addressed transparently. The generals began to see a pattern. Authority could be effective without intimidation. Discipline did not require spectacle, and compliance could coexist with autonomy. In quiet moments, the prisoners compared notes. Whispers of "they are pretending" gave way to reluctant admiration. Maps, railroads, factories, and grain elevators painted a portrait of a nation organized not by force but by principle. Civilization had rhythm, logic, and predictability. For men trained to measure victory by destruction and fear, these revelations were disorienting. The Atlantic crossing had delivered them not only to a foreign shore, but into a conceptual laboratory where ideology, morality, and practical intelligence collided. For the generals, the turning point was not a single event. It was cumulative. Day by day, observation by observation, interaction by interaction, the rigid certainties of the Reich began to dissolve, leaving only questions, curiosity, and an unsettling recognition that they were witnessing power exercised differently, yet no less effectively. The crescendo of disorientation arrived during supervised excursions outside the camp. The generals, transported in military trucks through unscarred towns and verdant farmland, sought a nation alive and productive. Freight trains rolled past, fully loaded with cattle and lumber. Children waved from bicycles, farmers paused in fields, and shop fronts gleamed with goods they had not seen in years. Every mile underscored a reality that propaganda had denied. America functioned seamlessly, abundantly, and without fear. The visit to the grain elevators in Iowa crystallized the shift. Inside, conveyor belts lifted golden corn to towering storage bins, a ballet of human ingenuity and machinery. An American engineer explained the process, joking lightly about feeding livestock, citizens, and exports. Vogler gazed upward at the machinery, awed. The scale and precision of American production left the generals speechless. One whispered to another, "We devoted architecture to power." It was not mere efficiency, it was purpose married to human welfare, a philosophy of organization that contrasted sharply with everything they had commanded. At night, back in the barracks, the generals began to confront the ideological collapse. Discussions among themselves were cautious, tentative, but unavoidable. The Reich had painted democracy as chaotic, decadent, and weak. Yet here was proof that order, prosperity, and influence could coexist with freedom. Every polite interaction with guards, every transparent system of discipline, every functioning civic process reinforced the same lesson. The turning point was complete. The captives were no longer merely prisoners. They were witnesses to an alternative model of authority, morality, and civilization. The months of exposure, observation, and guided interaction had dismantled ingrained beliefs. The shock of abundance, of competence exercised without coercion, and of civility underpins that moment when ideology finally yielded to evidence. For Vogler and his peers, the battlefield had shifted from Europe to perception itself. And they had been defeated not by guns, but by the quiet, relentless demonstration of a society that thrived on freedom. Repatriation lists began circulating by the summer of 1946, signaling the approaching end of captivity. For the German generals, the prospect of returning to their homeland was fraught with unease. Germany lay in ruins, cities reduced to rubble, infrastructure shattered, and civilians enduring scarcity and hunger. The contrast with the America they had just witnessed was stark, almost unbearable. Memories of bustling towns, functioning factories, and orderly farms clashed with the devastation awaiting them, magnifying both guilt and awe. Even as transport preparations commenced, the psychological imprint of American captivity persisted. The generals had been exposed to an alternative form of authority, one rooted in trust, transparency, and civil engagement. Each procedural act, from polite salutes to punctual meals, had reinforced the lesson that power could be exercised without fear, and compliance could coexist with personal agency. They had been shown a society where efficiency did not require oppression, where abundance was a measure of care rather than conquest. Their return to Europe was therefore bittersweet. While the journey home was physically straightforward, emotionally it was fraught. Each officer carried not only personal reflections, but also the cognitive dissonance of understanding that the systems they had helped lead into collapse could have been organized differently. The war, in a sense, had already been lost, not solely on battlefields, but in perception, ideology, and the realization that humane governance could achieve what rigid hierarchy and coercion could not. Once back in Germany, the generals confronted the full weight of their defeat. Cities lay in ash, industry was fragmented, and the civilian population struggled to survive. Yet the lessons from American captivity lingered, reshaping both thought and future action. Some officers became advocates for restructuring West Germany's military and civil institutions, promoting principles they had observed abroad: accountability, transparency, and the integration of authority with public trust. Others chose a quieter path, turning to writing and reflection, documenting experiences that illustrated how ideological rigidity had blinded them to alternative forms of power and governance. The camps in the United States had functioned as more than prisons. They had been laboratories in civics, psychology, and morality. The German generals left with a profound understanding that efficiency, strength, and social order need not rely on fear or coercion. Every visit to a factory, every conversation with a young American officer, and every glimpse of functioning society had etched an indelible mark on their perception of leadership. Over the following decades, these lessons subtly influenced the rebuilding of Germany. Officers who returned to service brought with them a cautious respect for democracy and civic responsibility, while those who refused military careers often contributed to political, educational, or social reconstruction. For the generals themselves, the experience underscored a paradox. Captivity had become an education, and the nation they had been conditioned to despise had imparted the clearest instruction of all. Freedom, administered with discipline and purpose, could achieve what conquest never could. The story of the German generals in American captivity is a lesson not in force, but in subtle, pervasive power. Across months of observation, discussion, and measured interaction, they learned that a society could thrive on freedom, civility, and efficiency without resorting to intimidation or spectacle. Authority, they discovered, did not require fear. It demanded clarity, consistency, and mutual respect. Civilization could advance not through conquest, but through creation. For men trained to measure strength in divisions and artillery, the realization was disorienting. America had not been defeated because it was fragile or decadent. It had endured and prospered because it mastered order through principle rather than coercion. Factories produced, farms flourished, railroads carried goods seamlessly, all guided by a system of invisible rules and civic trust. The generals saw that power exercised with restraint could achieve more than force wielded without conscience. In the end, captivity became a mirror, reflecting what ideology had obscured: the human capacity to govern itself with dignity, to organize life with imagination, and to cultivate strength without oppression. For Vogler and his peers, the war did not end on the battlefield. It ended in the recognition of this quiet authority, the hum of production, the rhythm of freedom. They had been prisoners of war, yet they left with a lesson far more profound than any defeat: that true power is measured not by destruction, but by the ability to sustain and create. The lesson endured. The loudest strength need not shout.